Dr. Andre Kushnerek and Dr. Elizabeth Boricki to take us through part 2 of this workshop session.
Okay, so can we see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the second part of the workshop. And as if we were here last time, my name is Andre Kushnerek, and I'm doing it with Elizabeth Boricki. We're both at the University of Victoria School of Health Information Science. So to begin with, if you did have time to actually try out my little exercise last time, and I had 2 questions you could answer in the chat box, and I will get back to it in a few minutes. So my first question was, if you tried them out, got a chance to, which did you find most useful, the usability inspection or the cognitive walkthrough? And what did the method tell you, either of them, about the application we looked at, if we got around to doing it? My second question is, if you did try the screen recording with the Think Aloud, did you try it? And I'm always interested to know what screen recording software you use. So if you just think about that, enter it in the chat, and I will be coming back to that in a few minutes. So that was from our informal exercise from last week. Okay, so as we said last week, the workshop goal as a whole is to become familiar with human factors approaches to health informatics for the design and evaluation of usable and useful healthcare systems. So the outline for today is just a little bit about the term usability, and all of you have heard the term usability, user experience, the relation between the two. We'll talk about getting into what I find the most interesting area is usability testing methods. We'll talk about how these methods can be extended for what we call clinical simulations and real-life evaluation, and a little bit about the role of usability in the systems analysis and design lifecycle, and moving this into real clinical settings and context, and doing it in a way that's not complex, not particularly complicated, and definitely not expensive. So I've already mentioned that if you were here last week, I'm professor and director of the School of Health Information Science at UVic, and my background was in computer science and cognitive psychology. And we also have, and the second half of today will be from Dr. Elizabeth Boricki, who's professor at the school and director of the Laboratory for Digital Health Innovation. So just to pick up from last week, there's a continuum of human factors evaluation approaches. And with some of the examples I'll talk about today, we'll talk about how in the same project or study we combine multiple approaches, or at least do them sequentially. Last week, on the far left in blue, we talked about what usability heuristics were. We talked about how the basic ones from Nielsen could be extended to safety heuristics and application of specific heuristics that we created for healthcare IP. We talked about the cognitive walkthrough, what I call the classic method, and a hybrid approach. Some of you might have tried. We'll get to that. I think someone mentioned that in the chat. We'll get to that in a minute. Today, we're going to do the 2 topics in red: low-cost, rapid usability testing, and clinical simulations. So this slide was from before. I think it's a good definition of usability from the textbook from 1993 by Priest and others. It provides a framework that has, for me, of designing studies, because usability is considered a measure of ease of use in a number of specific dimensions. And we can design studies around any or all of these. Dimension 1 is learning, or how easy it is to learn how to use an application. We can look at learning curves over time. 2, effectiveness. Is for the task we're looking at, is the system effective? Does it do what it's supposed to? 3, efficiency. Does it do what it's supposed to, but does it take too long or too many clicks? And we looked at the cognitive walkthrough as a method for analyzing that last week. Enjoyability we'll talk a bit about today, or lack of, in the case of many applications. Is it enjoyable to use or not? Very similar to usability questionnaires about satisfaction, perception. And last but not least, safety. I got into this field in healthcare around 1992, coming more from software engineering, where the term came up at the time, usability engineering. And I define that as scientific approaches to designing and testing usable systems. Now, another term that you've often heard probably recently is user experience. And we'll look at the relation of that to usability. I look at user experience as being a broader term, and we'll see how. In the literature on user experience, they talk about the components of user experience. One is usability, considered to be necessary for a good user experience. Usefulness, of course, the system should be useful to you. It could be usable, but not useful. Desirable, and again, this will be interesting how often health IP may be considered desirable. Findable, people can find it, know that it exists. This actually ties into things like marketing. Accessibility should be accessible to different types of stakeholders. Credible or trust, you can trust in it. The information is another aspect of it. And ultimately, value. Is it valuable to use? And this was just a graphic on website UX or user experience, showing that they include usability as a component of it. Even the expectation when we're buying a product, I'm going to buy a new iPhone, how I feel about even buying it is probably the user experience before I even got it. And just one metaphor here to help explain the difference that I like about user experience versus usability, using a road trip example. So think of the user experience like being the whole road trip, the whole experience of deciding to go on the trip, all the things that happen to you on the trip, getting lost on the trip, happiness, sadness is part of the user experience. And technically, usability is often considered more about how to get there, how to read the layout and the signage. Can you navigate through wherever you're going? So a bit of a metaphor. From a definition point of view from the International Standards Organization, we can see the relation. We define usability similar to the definition I gave above, as the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction within a specified context of use, like specific tasks. User experience could be considered the person's whole set of perceptions, experience, and responses that result from the use or the anticipated use of a product, system, or service, including usability. And what I found is a lot of labs now that have labeled themselves UX labs are basically usability labs. They're doing the same type of work. And the goals of user experience are that it should be enjoyable to use the system, potentially even fun. We can get into gamification to try to make it more interesting, useful, motivating, entertaining, perhaps satisfying, aesthetically pleasing. Some of these fit with the Nielsen heuristic. However, as we've seen in healthcare, achieving UX goals can be very challenging. And it's not that I think UX designers in healthcare aren't good. It's just it's much more complex than any other field. We have many more types of users, doctors, nurses, now patients with different literacy levels. The tasks in healthcare can be highly complex. There may be urgency, information may be coming in, there may be cognitive overload, information may be incorrect or missing. So designing for healthcare IP is challenging. In general, an approach that we say should be used in healthcare IP and other areas is called user-centered design. And it's the idea of three tenets to this. One is that we focus early on understanding user information needs, even from the beginning of the design, when designing a system or user interface. Secondly, this is where evaluation comes in. We continually evaluate the design within practical limits, as we mentioned last week, to get user feedback and iteratively make improvements before it's too late and the system goes out. But as I said last week, even with commercial products, we can apply these principles to optimize the implementation. And that the last tenet of this is that this should be done throughout the whole software development lifecycle. And I'm not going to focus a lot on questionnaires. Many of you probably use usability questionnaires, but I'll make a few comments. Well, one way, there are many ways to evaluate, and I'll talk about the main human factors methods that were left from last week to talk about. But you can do evaluation of usability using questionnaires, and I've done many applications of this myself. There are a number of standard questionnaires, the QUIS, the SUS is System Usability Scale, there's USE, and the SUME is often used. What we'll find is these questionnaires often are not specific to healthcare IP, but the general usability questions that are given, but they are validated. So what we'll see is there's often not a lot of questionnaires that are specific to, for example, usability of electronic health records. There are a few, but these general ones that are often in the literature are general questions. And for example, some of you may have used the SUS, System Usability Scale. That simply consists of 10 questions, like I think I would like to use the system on the 5-point Likert scale. Then they alternate with a negative phrasing. I found the system unnecessarily complex, etc. So you get the idea. There's only 10 questions. It is useful if you send this out and get a score back. If you give a high score in the literature, you can compare it and say that's high usability. However, as we'll talk about, this won't give you a lot of information about what exactly the change in the system. On a large-scale questionnaire that I worked with the Canadian Defense Department, they sent it out to every user of a new EHR in the world from the Canadian Defense. And it was useful. It came back that people answered the system was too slow. But after we knew that, we had to move into looking at some of the human factors methods I'll talk about. So there's a time and a place for questionnaires. And I will also mention, I think this is an outstanding application of questionnaires. From colleagues in Finland, and we worked on one of the papers with them. It was an online questionnaire that was given to all the, sent out to all the, I believe it was all the primary care physicians in Finland, specifically about usability, comparing products that they were using in the country. And that was very interesting. I believe they're doing it every 2 to 4 years now. And some of the findings from that is that usability didn't seem to be improving over time, which was interesting, but they got very specific information from it. But other than that, if you're interested in questionnaires, I have more information about it, but that's not going to be the focus of today. So this say they're useful for assessing end user perceptions in general, the satisfaction area. And the nice thing is they can be deployed to a large number of participants by simply sending out a link. In the old days, we had to send out paper questionnaires and that. Now it's much easier to send something by SurveyMonkey or send a link to SurveyMonkey. However, I would say for detailed understanding of how users interact with systems, problems they encounter, the methods that we've been talking about and will continue are very important. So at that point, I'm just going to pause and go through if we got some responses to our initial question. Well, Evangeline said for screen recording to use something called OBS Studio. And Evangeline, I believe that's free software. So there's a lot of free software for doing that. And by the way, why I had to try out the recording was that's the data I'm going to talk about today and show you all the things you can do with just simply recording the screens and the audio, for example, of thinking aloud. So OBS Studio, if you look in the chat, is one software. Oh, Amara David used Teams. I guess Teams allows you to record. Yeah, it does the interactions. Danica Tubin Oh yes, about the method. At the partway through last presentation, I mentioned the hybrid approach that we had developed at UVic, where we had to do the cognitive walkthrough and at each step also evaluate the heuristics. So she is using that to evaluate an online form for nurse practitioners. And that's useful. Okay. Kathy McGowan said both methods were good, but I found the cognitive walkthrough was good when I was looking through a health information website as if I was a patient looking for information medication. Heuristic was useful when I was browsing a mobile application. And she also used OBS Studio. So that's, I believe, a free one. Okay, Danica Pubin also used software called Camtasia. I've used it as well for recording screens and for presentations. Cole Mary said that, I just asked for the link to the web slide, the last week's slide deck. Yes, they will be made available. Yes, and Beth gave the link to where to get that. Okay, something about the link not working. Okay, that's about that. So anyways, I'm glad some people were able to try the little exercise. If not, don't worry. After today, you'll see where we're heading with this type of data that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to start by talking about, I always like to talk about the very first project I did in this area. It was early 1990s, and then move it along so you can see that you can layer on complexity without being too complicated. At least I hope to prove that. Okay, so back to usability engineering method. Last week, we talked about usability inspection. Now, to keep it clear, the inspection was not observing users. The inspector stepped through the interface when we did the heuristic evaluation and cognitive walkthrough. Today, I'm going to talk about what I find the most interesting is how we observe users actually using a system. And the definition I'm going to give for usability testing simply is observing representative users, doctors, nurses, for example, of an EHR, for example, doing representative tasks. And this is where task analysis comes in. We specify the task for replicability, like entering a medication or looking at documentation. The method I'll talk about, even from the very first study we did, we applied something from psychology called Think Aloud protocol, where the subject is asked to think aloud whatever's coming into their mind while they're using the system. And this borrowed from some classic work that was done in other areas in terms of human problem solving, how do experts solve problems, and we adapted it to healthcare IP evaluation. And we video record, visual recordings of screens, and sometimes also of the environment. And in our definitions, we created one called clinical simulation that says we observe representative users doing representative tasks as in usability testing, but we add a third thing that they either are doing it in representative or real environments. And usability testing may or may not be too real. So where can usability studies take place? This is just the diagram of what's known as the system development lifecycle. Many of you will be familiar with, or SDLC. We talk a lot about this in systems engineering. When we're designing a system, going through phases from planning, analysis, design, implementation, into practice, support, and then systems often have to be redone, and then we do them again when we retire them. When I started in this field in the early 1990s, most of the healthcare IP evaluation was at the far right. There were a lot of clinical trials of IP where one group got a system and one group didn't, for example, or one group got the system with the lips turned on, one didn't. And then we would do a clinical trial to see whether prescriptions went up or down. And there was a lot of that, but coming from software engineering, I thought that often won't tell you if something was good or not. Why? What part of the interface may be responsible for making it efficient or not? So over time, I've ended up working backwards with organizations that were interested in doing this work during the implementation phase, design, even earlier during analysis with mockups. And at the front end, I mentioned last week, doing it for system selection and procurement. Today, you'll see a number of examples where we've tried this at different points in system development. So what I'm a proponent of, I call low-cost rapid usability testing. And the argument is, and we'll see the whole range, that usability testing doesn't necessarily require an expensive laboratory. Can be done locally within your own healthcare organization. I won't get into it, but there are, I think last time we mentioned usability standards and conformance testing in the US for products. However, that won't assure, if they said it's certified, that it will be at all usable or useful in Victoria or Vancouver. So our argument is the methods should also be done locally within could be the systems departments or the hospitals here. And it's beginning to happen. We can predict and rectify errors using video coding, and we'll talk a bit about that today. And I will note, when we see the video coding we'll talk about today, it's rather formalized with coding schemes and all that. But we will, in many projects I've worked with, even recording users when they're having problems and taking it back to the developers and showing them those videos can be extremely useful as visual evidence. But today we will talk about it a bit formally with the video coding. Another argument that I've made for years is that the highest level of fidelity is if you conduct the usability testing in the real setting, like a hospital room, operating room after hours. You don't need to have $1 million lab that simulates an operating room. I've seen people doing this, and then they can't even run the local EHR in the room. I know a place that did that, I won't mention where, but and then we can also, if we set the recording up in an office or a hospital, and it's unobtrusive, then we can continue actually monitoring once the system went live. So what is this upside down triangle? It's kind of a model that we developed, and a lot of this came out of actually theory and pragmatics, because often I'd be called to look at the system, why is there a problem, why can't people use it? And it's an upside down triangle because it's more constrained at the bottom and then it gets more open-ended. And you can look at human-computer interaction in levels. One level is actually the single user using the system in isolation. So when we applied the cognitive walkthrough, it was that kind of a model. I'm one user using it. The first level of usability testing I'll talk about today is that level. One user, one system, what are the problems? What we're going to see is that we can optimize the system at level 1 and then say, okay, there's no problem when I have one doctor using it. Then we put it in the clinic, level 2, and then they're still saying it's not working. That's where we have to look at issues around workflow. So in the 3 examples I'll give of moving up the ladder today, and was done sequentially over time with the examples. And towards the end, I'll talk about a project where we package all of it together. And then even then, we might say, well, we optimize it for the clinic, but then people don't want to use it on the floor of the hospital. And that's level 3. You might get into issues of socio-technical issues like it changes the balance of power and who's the gatekeeper of the information. I usually cut out somewhere between 2 and 3. I like working from 1 up to analyze problems. But this framework I put my 3 examples in terms of this. So I like examples, and then Elizabeth afterwards will formally decompose this in terms of how to do these studies. If they seem at all complicated, they're not when we decompose them. The first one I ever did, it was actually, I think, in 1993 at McGill, and we got a contract with the drug company to evaluate the CD they were going to send out that had education in it and advertising. But we were focusing on the education part. It was going to be mailed out to doctors. So what we did is we brought them in the room, had them try the CD, 4 doctors separately, 1 hour each, and 4 medical students. And our first experiment in video recording the screens was really complicated then. You have to have a converter from PC to video. Now, all the software you private out, if you private out, is free, and we just hit a button, QuickTime, for example. And we told them it was our first experiment, and please think aloud or verbalize your thoughts with screen capture. We use started using, we don't have to be as fancy as using computer-supported video coding, but we actually started working with that back then. We used something called Transama since then, but before that, we actually used something called C-Video that allowed people to annotate the VHS videos of home movies on a Mac SE. And we modified that for annotating actual mouse clicks and what people were doing. Back then, we began working with developing video coding schemes. Video coding schemes can be used to identify cognitive aspects in reasoning and decision-making, as well as specific pinpointed problems with human-computer interaction. And this was from our initial coding scheme, and we'll see how it's applied in a minute. And years later, people said, well, can we publish on that plot? So we did a whole series of papers about 20 years later with 3 of them with coding scheme that you can apply. But what we did was modify, we made categories for analyzing the videos that came from heuristics, but for a completely different purpose, analyzing video, questionnaire scales, but for analyzing video. So we cannibalize those, and we have categories, for example, content. If in their interaction there's too much information, not enough, or it's incorrect, out of date, those are categories. Comprehension, can they comprehend the text or graphics? Remember this one for the example I'm going to give. We have a category called navigation. Can the user move forward or backward or find something in the system? User control and pace, system understandability. We created pretty comprehensive sets of this over the years. System robustness, does it crash? The other thing, not in the first example, in the second example, we'll see that when analyzing the video, we may also analyze at the same time of what they're doing on the screen. In the case where we ask them to think aloud about diagnosis or interviewing a patient, aspects of the past, right, requesting information, hypothesis generation. This is where, as you'll see, we bring in cognitive aspects. So what I'm going to show you is actually just the audio tape transcription of that first person thinking aloud. I don't have it here, but if we click on the numbers on the screen, we could click and see the corresponding video section. So after we made the video, we sat down, played it back, and brought up the transcript in the Word file on the Mac, and then started annotating it. We could stop the tape, put in the time counter, 1 minute, 3 seconds. We could annotate it as the introduction to the user of the system. And the user, if he saw the video, he looked nervous right away and said, I've already had to loosen my tie. And then at 2 minutes, 27 seconds, he goes into the risk analysis guideline screen and says, right off the bat, I use usefulness under usability, but on some of the definitions have usefulness under user experience. But the idea is it has to be useful. So at that point, the user said the information is old. I don't know if I've updated it. Well, we did this study in 1993. All the information got updated in 1990, apparently, and they had information that was dated before that. Everyone that was a doctor picked it off. So it was an example right from the beginning that it's not enough to have human factors engineers that would get a nice layout of the screen, but the medical examples, the usefulness is as or more important. We could follow through what them raising cholesterol levels that the video I could show you. Okay, at one point in the interaction, the user says, how do I fast forward? You're stuck. Bingo, that's where we put in the category navigation problem. So what we're doing, and we can even get into a rate of reliability on the video coding, is marking where issues come up. With this approach, we use with many projects. We could even get stats on how many navigation problems are there in module A or module B, and zeroing in on fixing that. Or it could be consistency. And one of the projects I work with Half the time the cursor blinked, we could enter. Half the time we couldn't. Nobody could use it. They were confused. No one could verbalize that. But when we coded it, we had over 100 consistency problems. And then when we fixed that, it was level 1 testing. It flew. The users could use it. So this can pinpoint and give you statistics because you can quantify qualitative codes. I've done this. I know you can, and we've done that. What's the average number of navigation problems? So that's the idea. You can follow the user using the system. Is there no way out of this? The experimenter says you can kill it. Okay, it goes to the risk analysis screen. And unbeknownst to the developers, we were supposed to be at the end of the development when we were asked to test it. The system is still crashing. So that was interesting information. We told the people sending the software out, don't send it out till we fix it. They spent $80,000. We told them it would cost you less than a couple thousand to fix it. They sent it out and they had to call it back in. It was embarrassing for the company, not for us. And then when it's restarting, the user's going, it's kind of old. I probably would turn it off because the information was not up to date. Then it goes back to the risk analysis screen, turns the head sideways, says the option menu. I don't know what is the option menu. It didn't come with instructions. Actually, if we looked at Nielsen's heuristics, it didn't have any online help. You get the idea. So it's kind of a disaster interaction. Yeah, we did that a long time ago, but I would have to say I have analyzed many systems since then, and this type of thing is still coming up. So we need to look at how can we decompose it ideally before you release it. At the time, we were also comparing when they do the task, remember task analysis, afterwards, we started off giving usability questionnaire right after. And over time, we ended up saying, no, we'd rather do a semi-structured interview after the task. And we learned that from the very first time because this was a response in the same subject to a standard usability questionnaire, a 5-point Likert scale. I just put their answer. I found the program easy to use. For some reason, the user said agree somewhat. Easy to learn, agree somewhat. Content is presented clearly, agree completely. Well, this was an issue that we initially hit us. If you have a questionnaire, you presuppose what the issues might be. We should have asked, is the content up to date? But we didn't know that. And with technology, many of the issues are emergent. We don't know them beforehand, etc. So the conclusion was the questionnaire didn't really agree with the video. Oh yeah, I know I've said in the chat, do users tend to overstate or understate the navigational ability on surveys? Yeah, there's the thing that you do forget things even from a minute before, but I don't think that's the thing, because if I do an interview, they'll probably more right after. Often people on questionnaires at the beginning maybe just go, good, I want to leave, or sometimes they would tell me, good work, keep up the good work. They were probably a biased sample to get them. They want to be involved. And then they think I'm the designer. And then the other part is simply some of these other issues. So as I said, I'm not against questionnaires. I do them for large-scale deployment studies where I'm not going to interview 1,000 doctors in the country. But often for this type of study, we have done the approach where we do the usability, observation, video, and we'll show you where we do a semi-structured interview. So that was our very first experience. That led to us becoming very interested in cognitive aspects of usability. What was the effect of IP on reasoning, individual decision-making, group decision-making, and workflow? And last but not least, in the last number of years, technology-induced error. Could analysis of cognitive aspects be integrated with analysis of usability? So back to this diagram, I'm going to show in the next example, we're going to move up to level 2. I'm not very far up, but we're going to look at the user at level 1, but then we're going to set up some scenarios where we're going to record doctor-patient interaction involving the computer. So now we have people doing a real task, interviewing a patient using the computer. We're moving up a bit. And this was a whole set of studies, 2 papers there. The first one was way back 96 in MB Computing. And the last paper we did on this was 2000. Patel, Kushnik, Yang, Yale. That was the one I said if you're interested in. That was in the Journal of American Medical Association. Impact of a computer-based patient record system on data collection, knowledge organization, and reasoning. This was an interesting whole set of studies at McGill where they were moving a whole diabetes clinic from paper onto the first electronic record system. So it allowed us, and they were going to get a free computer, free software if they used it, and they didn't have to adopt it. If they didn't want to use it, they didn't have to. So it was a really nice study of why or why not would someone adopt new technology. We did do experimental study of use of the system. We had the doctors sit down with the EHR and think aloud, verbalize their thoughts, and recorded them. But in this one, we moved up to level 2, our first experience in what we call working in the clinical simulation with a simulated patient. Someone trained the patient while the doctor interviewed them and used the computer. So we video recorded a lot. We video recorded the training sessions from the vendor. With very few studies about the training of the EHRs, although that, as we'll see, was the biggest factor predicting adoption was whether they went to all the training. We also videotaped users, doctors, the style of interacting with patients before the computer came in. The method we used was borrowed from medical education. If any of you or some of you are physicians, are you familiar with the OSCE exams? The horrible exam. I'm not a physician where apparently you get graded on interviewing someone playing a patient. And I worked in the medical education lab, so we said we'll borrow that, but instead now for our experiment, we'll have the doctors or medical students using a computer while interviewing the patient. And we followed them over time as they learned how to use the system while interviewing patients. And as another part of the experiment, we also, when they started to move their records over into the computer, asked them to be as accurate as possible and compared the paper versions of records to electronic to see whether any information got missed when they moved it over. So there's a whole series of studies. That one paper in Zamia has most of it. This was the system. I always ask, has anyone seen this one? I probably shouldn't disclose the company, but has anyone? No, probably no one seen this one. It was actually in Quebec a number of years ago. I saw the game later. It got used by Defense Department. But it was an interesting design. I knew the designer, and he had come up with the idea of a more like a paper scroll metaphor. That you could interview the patient and click on categories, use a pen and write on it. They have it on the laptop. So this would be like if the patient came in and said they had a cough, it loaded the filter for cough and we could click on it. So an interesting idea, and how we studied it in the interaction was actually kind of shown on the next screen from the magazine. What we did, this is the setup. That was my colleague playing a patient, playing a doctor. Well, we did with real doctors, David Kaufman. And so the doctor would come in, use the system. You see, nice idea, put on a pen, you can scroll down, click on it. Interviewing a patient, someone playing a patient. I'm standing in the back with one of those big cameras at the time, recording. So what's being recorded? Now, if you use the QuickTime or the OBS, whatever recording you use, you could record yourself thinking aloud, right? And the screens and play it back. That's the data. In this case, the screen being recorded isn't going to be a think aloud because you can't be thinking aloud while talking to the patient. It will be a full record of what the doctor is clicking on and the dialogue with the patient. And then very interesting, we brought in some ideas from dialogue analysis to see how the computer affected the dialogue. I'm standing in the back with the camera, because it's a simulation, it's not real. I wouldn't do that in the real doctor's office. We have done this with companies later, but then it was a serial mounted camera. But it's artificial. So what I'm collecting is data on what are they doing on the desk? How long does it take them before they go on the computer, before they go back to paper? So the company and companies ever since have wanted to know how it works in the real practice. So that's what we did. So that's the overview of some of the things. We also did interviews with all 16 clinic staff before it went in. That was fascinating. We asked them, do you expect it to make life easier or harder? And some said easier, and then later on they said harder, and some flipped the other way 6 months later, and some dropped out completely using it. We did the usability testing with a subset of them. As I mentioned, we videotaped the training. Fascinating. All the doctors came in for the whole clinic and the nutrition people, everyone for a whole day. And we found that when they presented the information, some of them got beeped away, never got to the end of the day. The head of the department said, no, I'm going to get my secretary to do this, and walked out. Yeah, remember, this was mid-90s. And later on, we had to call the trainers back to do one-on-ones. And the ironic part was, well, giving away one of the findings was, when they came back, they then showed the users the customization feature, how they can modify the screens for their patient. And that was the biggest predictor of adopting it a year later. We log all the computer use as well. And as I said, we compare paper version to computer version of the same patient. Our results were the following. We got what we call more irrelevant information in the paper records, probably not the right term. What we meant was information that wasn't directly related to the primary diagnosis. Now, it probably wasn't really irrelevant. In many studies looking at narrative notes versus computer, the narrative notes have a lot of information, but we found the same thing. Interesting thing is, when we asked them to enter the same information on the paper accurately in the computer, we were finding, and we counted every piece of information, that we were getting about 25% less information in the computer. And we even found that with some other systems. So it's not to say they all did that, but what were some of the reasons? If I go back up the screen, as in all electronic health records, there's a number of categories of information. On this one, they're on tabs on the left-hand side, from CC, chief complaint, all the way down. The tab open is PE, physical exam. What we found is the designers, for some of these categories of information, really fleshed the screen out, may have been in a hurry with some and didn't do it for other categories of information. So that may have affected how much information they put in, which was to say, how the designers do something like that affects what information goes in, affects everything, including diagnosis. But the most interesting one we found with this system was, and this one came back later, I'll talk about a 2012 study where some of this came back as well in a different form, looking at clinical guidelines. We saw what we call the change in reasoning from hypothesis-driven to screen-driven. So what do we mean by that? Hypothesis-driven or screen-driven? Back to the screen. What we found was if a patient came in came in with a cough or whatever, they'd be going through, they see the screen, which kind of guides you to fill out the categories in the order on the screen. But some of them said, I don't want this order. I want to ask another question. I want to go out of this frame. It didn't really have a good search capability to go out of the one we loaded. And some people found that was kind of guiding them a bit. But a lot of people couldn't tell you what was going through their head. But we did notice at some point, a lot of them said, after they were kind of fighting with that problem, said, okay, I've got it now. And those doctors, we found, just started following the categories on the screen. So we call that screen-driven. And when we did this, at the beginning, when someone did that, they weren't aware of it. But several months later, they kind of, if they still used the system, they were aware of it. I'll show you. And then they either adapted to it, modified it, or didn't use the system. So it was, again, a very subtle effect, but profound on decision-making. That the way that was laid out affected. They felt, well, they didn't even realize it was driving what they were doing. And at the time, we were working, again, back to the medical education lab we worked on at McGill. We were also working on some separate work, the group there, not me per se, but on for medical education reasoning patterns. And there's two main types if you're into medical education. One's called forward or directive reasoning, going from individual data to hypotheses. And the other is called backward reasoning, from hypotheses backwards to data. And I also did work on human expertise, and human experts, when they're working at an expert level, move forward. They look at individual data, something they see in the patient, maybe the skin color, maybe some lab result, and move directly to a hypothesis. And then they ask another question and move directly to another hypothesis. In medical education, often they're learning the rules. Okay, leukemia is associated with what symptoms, the signs, working backwards. So what we were finding was some of our expert physicians, when they initially adopted the system, appeared to be moving to more backward reasoning pattern with the system, because they walk into a particular clinical template, which would kind of get them thinking going backwards. And many of them found that constraining from the normal pattern of being able to jump around in their own knowledge base. So that was what we were comparing that and to that literature and that approach. But to give you a pretty practical idea of how this worked, this was the log file. I showed you before a log file of someone thinking aloud. At the level of granularity of someone interacting with the patient and the computer, again, we have a corresponding video that we annotated on the word processor with the timestamps and what they were doing. So we're not at the fine-grained level of what they're clicking on, it's more like what are they doing. So now we're actually moving the human factors analysis to the workflow level. And for that user, or one of the users we had, this user was an experienced user with the system who liked it, adopted it, was a psychiatrist and had certain cases and built his own templates, went to the training, liked it. But he was still very careful using it. For 2 minutes and 30 seconds, he creates the patient visit and then reviews the complaint and goes in to get one of those clinical filters and then stops. And then, because we have the external video, he goes back to using paper for up to 9 minutes, then goes in, gets the template, and follows the categories on the screen that he had designed. So when we interviewed him, he said, yes, I adapted my style to the system because I felt it was leading me in a certain way I didn't want to, and then I had to find my way of interacting. So then began a whole lot of studies that were done elsewhere on top of that, looking at human-computer patient interaction. But that started from the video. So we're into 2 levels now. One comment before I go further is that these studies can be on a continuum. We can look at them at the lab level, and the lab could be a million-dollar usability lab, or what I mean by laboratory artificial is having someone come in the office and record them using it. A system doesn't have to be expensive. Simulations, what I gave in the last one where we interviewed, where the user interviewed the patient, would be an example of a simulated work activity, a simple one, simulated doctor-patient interaction. What I'm going to talk about now is a progression that we moved into doing these studies in situ, in the real or realistic setting. This gets into areas also remote usability testing, can do over Zoom, but also automated logging and tracking of users and data analytics, which I won't really get into in this presentation. That gets into analyzing interactions on a large scale. So back to this diagram, we're moving up a notch to kind of moving up to a higher level in my third and middle final example. So this one was an interesting project that was done around 2006. We were working with a CEO of a hospital in Japan, in Papori, Japan, Sige Kawapa, and they had just gotten a new medication administration system, and they were also bringing barcoding in and all that around that time. And we were initially going to do a study remotely over the internet from Japan. That didn't work very well because there was a time delay and there were firewalls to the hospital. So we simply sent CABA collaborators as very simple instructions for doing a simulation of usability testing. get 16 subjects. He got 5 nurses, 11 doctors after hours, go into a room where everything was set up, including the interfacing technology, the barcoding, and the computer. There was a dummy patient, a real dummy, not a computer mannequin, and we came up with a set of tasks. So as I said the last time, task analysis is important. We have administering different types of drugs. So I'll just show you the screen here. This was from our video coding tool we started using later called Transcription, where you could bring up different video views. On the bottom left was a video view across the room on the Sony camera on the tripod, where we could see what they did with the patient hanging the bag, IV bag. When they went on the computer on the laptop, that was the system, and then a med system. Then we had that HyperCam, that very inexpensive program running on it for recording screens. So for the analysis, we synchronized the external view from the camera with the HyperCam view. So when they did go on the laptop, on the big screen, we could see what they're clicking on, scrolling through, etc. And there, I didn't learn Japanese, but our colleague told us we could code it because he showed us what the screens were. That's the order entry screen. And at this point, they've read the screen and gone over to hang an IV bag. So the analysis here can be actually, the other thing is, with that tool, that black panel on the top left that says subject 14, you can click on it and then in the same screen bring up a log file, the annotated file. And then that would have what they were doing, and we could click on the numbers on there and go directly to the screen. So the first order, they search for the patient on the computer, view the order list, select the order, verification screen appears. They go on top of the patient, even though it's a dummy, they follow the instructions and have a conversation with the patient. They scan the patient ID. They go back to the computer, view the execution information, and then, et cetera, then they go to the next one. So the idea was barcode scanning is to increase safety. But what we found is there were times when this very rigid system might pose a problem itself. And that came up with our testing. Instead of doing a questionnaire after they did the task, this would be an example of a simple semi-structured interview after. We just said, did you find any difficulty handling the barcode reader? No, but sometimes the scanner doesn't respond to the barcode. Also, the cord of the scanner is too short. That's ergonomic. We could actually see that from the video too. And then they said, in terms of having difficulty, I want a more simplified system. The more patients are, the more difficult verification becomes. Sometimes in an emergency, we have to skip this procedure. Throughput, time-taking process, and someone might need urgent help. But with this system, I don't think you'll be able to do that. So they pick off, and we saw that on the video as well. So what we did with them is simply recommend an emergency override before deploying it all over the hospital. And so they found this type of testing quite useful and did it for many other projects as well, because it was a check before going live. If we compare the aviation, they do a lot more checking about devices, airplanes and that before they put passengers on than we do in healthcare. So it's kind of adding a layer of simulation. Bottom line, we found potential sources of medication error and things that were not thought about by designers or customizers. And the idea is better to do this before going widespread. Just to say, we've done since then work on predictive analysis to prevent errors and improve usability. Many projects improvement of software. Some of the projects led to improvement of the process of development and implementation, rolling out how to bring the training group in and follow users over time, how to find out if you have to modify what they're being trained, given on subsequent usability testing. Customizing of vendor products was a big one. Even if you have a product that's being developed, there's so many decisions about how to implement it that the methods I'm talking about today, like the last example was a commercial product, but we were able to fix the problem. It's generally new software testing methods. And I think I mentioned last time the application of some of the methods in system selection and procurement. where if we're going to have some candidate systems to buy, we could require in the process that they be subjected to either usability inspection or perhaps even usability testing. And the example I gave last week was in Denmark, where they actually took that advice and required this type of testing before buying a system. And they evaluated 3 systems this way. There are different approaches. So we've looked at 3 levels of laboratory-based usability testing or inspection, clinical simulation, and then in situ or going near-wide. So, and this was from the rubric of medical informatics. I just want to say that this stuff could be packaged in a way that it could do all 3. So we wanted to prove that within practical constraints of a real project, we could do all 3 layers in one. So that came about on a project that was done at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York with colleagues called Integrating Usability Testing and Think Aloud Protocol with Near-Wide Clinical Simulations. So the project here I won't spend a lot of time on was not implementing an EHR. They had an EHR, Epic, but it was adding clinical guidelines that would be triggered on top of it. So another type of implementation. And what we did when it was the first time we were added, they were called best practice advisories. We did 3 layers of testing, had doctors in their office sit down and think aloud while using a script. We did the clinical simulations in level 2, where we had them interact with a digital patient to see how they use the information. And then we also studied a limited number of live interactions before implementing it across the hospital system. And at every step, we optimized the application. So we started with the prototype implementation of the guidelines, did the level 1 usability testing, redesign fixes, then the level 2 clinical simulation fixes, and then finally it went to a clinical trial with 2 groups, one group getting the guidelines, one group not, and because we optimized up to them, it had a very high uptake. And I won't go through examples, but we had coding categories from a coding dictionary. Elizabeth will mention a bit about this in a moment, like coding categories usability, referring to perceived effectiveness, efficiency, or ease of use, or lack of. And example quotes is becoming a lot of clicking and reading, especially if we have a lot of patients waiting. Our workflow was interesting. That we defined as referring to commentary or interaction about the general sequence or order of tasks. And some of the participants picked off an issue with this. One said, as an example quote, I think it depends on when we start using the tool. Because if you use it right from the beginning, you can get distracted and forget other questions. I think the order sets, one of the things that did was dump you into these order sets quickly, the automated tool. The user said they should come in when you ask them, not from a walk-in diagnosis. Because in one of the scenarios, it actually triggered the guidelines before they even saw an x-ray, and it was a guideline about pneumonia. So again, it was this issue that I mentioned earlier about how the system comes on, how much it guides you. Some of them felt it was pushing them to a medication order set too early. And we also won't get into, we're able, the graph on the bottom right, we were actually able to decompose the different components of the decision support. There was an initial alert came up. Many people didn't click on it. At level 1, we found why, because the button said BPA and people didn't know what BPA meant because it was designed in another state. So then we told them just write out best practice advisory. That was a level 1 problem. Level 2 are things about workflow and not triggering. So every level came with different optimizations. And we were also, the black bars on the right are comments, whether they were positive or negative. And on the right graph, we have the components of the system, which included an initial alert, a risk calculator for pneumonia or other things that were alerted. A smart set was the order set. So right away from the proportion of white to black, we can see for smart sets, that's the orbiting set, that most of the people didn't like them. And we have lots of reasons why. So we have to optimize the triggering. However, for calculator, although the overall bar is shorter, that's the second one on the right, Most of it is right. Some of them really like the risk calculator. Some of them even went into the decision support just to get to the risk calculator to confirm their decision. So again, we were looking at how to bring the system in the way that interacted and the way that the clinicians wanted. This has still become a big issue now. Last time I was there, they had over 100, I believe, best practice advisories, and there were issues about how to present them in the way that was most useful. And I think I've mentioned the results. So anyways, the point of that study was that we combined within a finite time, it was a couple of months, that type of testing with the implementation. So with that, I'm going to give Elizabeth enough time to just briefly mention, those are some examples, some of the idealized steps you can use in order to do this type of studies.
Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to go through the phases and steps. This is actually a really nice guide. If you want to look at them in more depth, there's citations at the bottom that you can use to sort of help you with writing your protocols. So the first step is to identify the evaluation objectives, and this involves looking at the how, when, where, why, and who of the usability test. In this process, you actually end up scoping out what the test is going to do, as well as the purpose of the testing. It's also an opportunity to start thinking about the context of the testing. Where is it taking place? How representative is it? And also to provide one with an overview of the approach that will be taken. The second step is the study design, where you would identify specific target populations. So for example, if you are looking at patient users, you would identify what types of patients you would like to have participate in your usability tests. And just a little note here, as Andre mentioned earlier, if you have about 8 to 10 participants, you roughly get about 80% of the surface usability problems. If you're looking at publishing, then you require a few more additional participants, usually in the range of about 15 to 20, so that you can do inferential statistics. This is an example of two different types of study designs. The one up here at the top is an example of a within subject study design, where you have the same individual exposed to different variations of a user interface. Usually with this type of design, you go from what would be commonly seen by an individual through to user interfaces that are perhaps new that you want to try out and to see what response they have. In the between subject design, this is what I would call a randomized experimental design, where you have potential subjects and they're randomized to either see version A of a user interface or version B of a user interface. Step 3, it looks at the selection of representative experimental tasks and context. So this is really important. You need to know what you're going to do, what you're expecting the person to do when using your system. And in addition to that, you need to understand the tasks that you're planning on them being able to perform using your technology. And what's really nice to do here is to actually write some task scenarios. So these are essentially written descriptions of cases, and they may involve scripts. For example, you might have a simulated doctor-patient interaction involving a technology to see how well the system performs. And they can be performed systematically. Here's an example of a hierarchical task analysis. So here we have an electronic medical record, which can be decomposed into specific activities, scheduling, medication ordering, document review, and labs. And then medication order entry can be decomposed further into medication review, medication entry, and alerting. So you might use this to actually inform how you would write your scripts and what specific tasks you might be testing on in terms of the usability testing. And here's a little example of a typical usability testing task scenario. So here Jane D is going to be entering some information into an EMR while she's thinking aloud or essentially verbalizing her thoughts. So there we go. Step 4, that's actually the selection of the background questionnaires. So you might want to look at specific types of questionnaires that you would administer before the test itself, as well as afterwards. Good ones to administer before a test actually is conducted is information about collecting information about the demographic, the background of the individual. So you can get that demographic information about their education. And you might also want to look at things such as e-health literacy or digital health literacy, as well as work experience and organizational experiences. Those particular background characteristics can influence how well an individual uses the technology. In terms of post-test questionnaires, you might also create specific questions that are essentially triggered depending on how the person interacts with the system, so you can get more detail around what's happening and why. And then there's step 5, where you might want to look at selecting your evaluation environment, and that could be a lot of different places. So, for example, as Andre said, you could use an office. You could use a simulation laboratory that simulates an office. You could go to a real-world clinical setting that is very representative and use a room from that setting and to conduct your testing, as was the example that Andre gave from Japan, where we used a room that wasn't being used at the time in the clinical setting. And the portable approach that Andre described earlier is a great way of doing that, because you can actually go in situ. So it's very realistic. Here's some examples of some setups for usability tests. And again, you could do this in your local facility. So what you would do is you would have an individual that might be stepping through the user interface, performing specific tasks. You have a moderator that would ask some questions, perhaps at the end of the session. And then you would have either an external video camera, or you might just exclusively just do screen recordings, depending on the task or activity. So to give an example, if it's just going through, let's say, a mobile app, and an individual might be doing that by themselves, then you could recreate that. If it's a situation where you have a nurse or a physician that's interacting with equipment in addition to an electronic health record, you might want to have an external view. And so there's different types of settings. This upper left-hand setting is an example of a simulation lab where you have a physician and 2 artificial patients, and then you have the usability team evaluating a new technology in the sim lab. In the below, this is actually a picture of our smart home lab, where we're looking at different types of user interface designs and software, as well as devices on home use of health technologies. And step 6, we also have to consider what kind of data collection or video recording equipment. I think quite a few people actually have mentioned this already, but there are different types of video recording equipment that can be used, screen recording software. So it's something that's really important to identify and then try out before you actually have your usability testing. And the reason why is you want to make sure that you've figured out the process and worked out any potential bugs in terms of being able to record what's going on. This is some example of some of the recording equipment we've used over the years, and that's actually a picture of Dr. Kushnick with an external camera recording some of his activities. But you can use a lot of different types of recording equipment. So here, there's actually a document camera that's being used to record the screens on a mobile device as part of a usability test. And you can see this here on the laptop. There's the user interface on the mobile device. There's a lot of different types of recording equipment. We mentioned a few earlier, thanks to some of our participants. And also you can use other types of screen recording software. Thinking aloud, that's a very important part of usability testing. It allows you to actually see what, or have a view into what a person's thinking while they're using the technology. And it's really important to continually remind an individual to please think aloud and verbalize your thoughts. Having done many of these types of studies, I find one of the things that oftentimes happens is that an individual gets engrossed and then forgets to verbalize what they're saying. So you have to remind them in a way that doesn't disrupt their thinking processes while they're working with the technology. Some post-task usability questionnaires, as I mentioned earlier, you could ask questions about how well or how easy you found it to use the system. You could also make notes during the actual usability test about potential issues that the individual ran into, and actually bring them back to that point in time in terms of the recording and ask what happened. I find that's kind of useful to find out, especially if there's some issue that comes up and that's not discussed at the end in the post-task interview prompts. Step 7 is the analysis. So this is the whole process of transforming the data into recommendations. You're obviously going to collect qualitative data. That data can be quantized, as I said earlier, for inferential statistics to be done. It allows you to see a lot in terms of what participants are thinking about, what their physical actions are, what kinds of communication patterns and social interactions they have, as well as the dialogue they have with the technology. So here are some examples of some measures that you might want to look at in terms of quantitative analysis, like, for example, the time to complete a task, the time needed to recover from errors, number of incorrect icons selected, search time. All of these things could be measured during testing. Video coding, there's different ways to code the data. Oftentimes you can use a predefined coding scheme. We've actually looked at different types of coding schemes, and they can be informed by theoretical perspectives. They can come from the data itself, so that's more of a grounded theory approach. And you can use different types of categories from the theory, as well as emergent categories that may emerge in relation to the technology and how the test is going. So, and here are some examples of some coding schemes that have been derived from the research literature. So here's an example of a usability problem code. So the first one is navigation, for example. There's a definition that you use to inform your coding, and then here is an example. And there are varying different ones, and by no means is this list exhaustive. There's a lot more in terms of coding schemes that has been developed out there based on the research. Here is an example of a coding scheme that we've developed here with our work in terms of looking at the relationship between varying aspects of human-computer interaction, workflow, socio-cognitive aspects of system interaction, reasoning, and also decision-making. And as you can see, there are both cognitive codes as well as usability codes that fall into those buckets. And here's an example of a coding scheme. So this is actual qualitative data. And what you do is you look at what you actually do transcriptions of what that data is. So here's a transcription. So I am waiting for the medication entry screen to appear. I've clicked on what I think is the enter medication icon, but I'm not sure. And then what you can do is you can use this coding scheme to code what that means. So in this case, we coded it as a meaning of icons problem and also a technology problem. Down here, you can see the same kind of thing. Okay, it finally came up, but it seems like it took forever. And so we've coded this as speed and a response time problem. Here's actually one that I have issues with in the last little while is I'm trying to, I select from a list, but my eyesight's getting poor and the font is too small. So it's a font problem that comes up. And in this particular case, you can actually see that, that the person actually selected the wrong medication as a result of not being able to see what effectively what was there. So there's a lot of different types of software that can be used to assist with the analysis of video-based coding of usability data. This is actually a screenshot of Transana, which allows you to integrate different video feeds, plus it's time-stamped with the audio transcript. But there are others, there's other software that you can use to do this type of analysis. So MaxQDA has been used by some researchers. We're also doing some work with in vivo here. So that's an option depending on what you have available and how much you want to pay. In terms of interpreting the findings, the data can be compiled and summarized in a lot of different ways. So for example, you might look at task accuracy as a form of quantitative data, time to complete tasks, but then you also might look at, for example, all the different qualitative codes and which ones come up and how frequently they come up and what effect they have on, for example, key things that you're studying, such as the ease of fixing of that particular aspect of the user interface or even safety. Last but not least, step 9, where one has to think about what do you want to get from all of this. So the important thing to remember is that software is pliable. We can modify user interface designs. So conducting the testing can oftentimes be a great way to provide feedback around the user interface design, some of the workflows, even the structure of the environment where the individual might be using the software. So it's really important to distill out your key recommendations or learnings from your testing. We've worked on a number of different types of applications, anywhere from mobile apps through to remote monitoring, pervasive computing devices, as well as home care and virtual applications here. And as you can see, usability testing can be applied to a lot of different technologies. On that note, I'm going to shift back to Andre for the conclusions.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to conclude that we do need a range of methods for this area for usability, and that there is a need for dissemination of the methods. I think that's really important. And the idea that the methods are accessible, they can be applied without a lot of cost, and that they would have a big impact. The other thing is you can apply the methods, as you've seen from today and last week, for two purposes, both to improve systems, but also for research as well. So it's quite interesting. Often on studies that we will both have an academic side to and also a pragmatic. So I hope it's been useful, and a lot of different methods in 2 weeks, but I encourage you to play with it and try it out. And if you have questions, just email me or Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre and Elizabeth. Thank you also for sending your slide deck over. There's a lot of methods that we can use in our future research and work. We do have one question from the chat, again, to the audience members, if you have any questions that you'd like Andre and Elizabeth to answer, feel free to just type it out into the chat. If you want to direct message Beth and myself as well, that is okay as well. So the question we have is, do users tend to overstate or understate their navigational abilities on surveys?
Yeah, that can happen. People often don't seem to kind of remember what they did, which is why we like to record. But often that's a problem with when we ask for their perception. I mean, satisfaction is very important to ask them, that's their perspective. But I've often seen, for example, I've been getting the focus groups. I've done many. For me, focus groups are, essentially group semi-structured interviews. Often when people say they've done usability, they may have done a focus group, and then the focus group is often separated in time from when they actually use the system. And then often people will be overstating. There's often biases in focus groups. like, yeah, I didn't have problems, or they don't remember the problems they had. Although I do use focus groups and requirements analysis where you want people to brainstorm, but for evaluation, then I often, when we ask people when they're disconnected from the task, they may overstate abilities or not be able to pinpoint their problems. If you give them very rigorous set of tasks and then immediately interview them about their experience, that tends to correspond better. But often, yeah, if you just ask people without having this other data, you may not get to what the issues are. That's a very good question.
Is there any
Oh.
benefit for having like a high perceived usability among your users? Like, are they, let's say, if they score, if you use a system usability scale and it's a very high score, does that mean they're more likely to at least start using it? But then it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to continue using it if they find navigational problems and things like this. Is there any work or research about that?
Well, you saw that one. That was like 10 very, very simple questions. So when they're applying that to something complicated like an EHR, what I found with those kind of things, they might trigger you. I mentioned one with a national Defense Department system where a national questionnaire clearly indicated everyone thought it was too slow. But with that project, that wouldn't have been enough. But we had shown some consultants how to do screen recording with Hypercam, and they were actually able, without doing fancy video recording, to show that some parts of the system were actually bogged down when people went into them. And so that you couldn't get from a very simple questionnaire. So the problem with it is, and then the other thing with questionnaires is, those are all validated, and you can get validated questionnaires, but they often don't ask the questions that you want. So, for example, with an EHR, you may want to ask, how is the patient complaint presented properly? And that's not going to be on a validated scale. What I tend to do is have heads. If I have someone, for example, doing a PhD thesis, I say throw in a scale or subscale like SUMI or SUS, so that when the examiner asks to use a validated scale, you have it. But some of the questions that may be more interesting or useful on the survey may be ones that you came up with that were specific to imaging display or something like that you're not going to go through and do a validation of the scale is a whole research project in itself. So yeah, and as I said, the scales have their purpose. If there's something else, I found the one in Finland where they sent out to 2,000 or 3,000 physicians was amazing, and they were able to have questions comparing products and bring that back for different purposes. So yeah, but often people tend to overstate when they remove from the actual context. I see one here. How hard is it to pick up qualitative coding skills for video analysis? I'm in engineering and intimidated with qualitative research learning. You'll be learning the back of okay. That's a really good question. I find it doesn't have to be that complicated. The very first time we did qualitative coding, me and one of my colleagues, we tried to code everything and it took forever. That's why the coding schemes are useful. If you find a coding scheme that has some categories, for example, about safety, then if you transcribe that interaction and watch the video, you don't have to code for everything. You can code for the categories related to safety. And another way, that's using a coding scheme. The other way is from very informally, you could watch the video, look at the transcript, and just annotate where you think something has emerged. Like, I'll give you an example. This is how we created categories on privacy. We didn't have it in the categories. More and more patients were using systems, and they were worried about privacy. And in looking at the video and what they were saying, it would come up that I'm concerned about entering the information about privacy. So then we just annotated that with privacy concern. So the coding, and that we call inductive, but you don't have to get into that. So if you keep the coding very purpose and maybe get some ideas from some existing categories, and as I said, the coding itself can be on the scale of formula. from very formal with any label reliability to, as I said, the example of showing a screen why it was slow was actually not even actually coded. It was just showing they had written down some video times where they could show the developers where it was slow. So it can be on the range, but I would start simple with this. If I record myself or somebody else and then watching that with the video, and then at the time point where something interesting occurs, it could be as simple as annotating it. So, but using all those tools, not even necessary. When I have students who are distributed and may not have the software for the video coding, I've simply said, if you have two computer screens, open up a word processor file on one and watch the video on another computer. And then if you transcribe what they said, you could pause the movie, put the timestamp in the Word file, and then put the code. Very interesting, couldn't navigate. So good to start simple and try it out. Again, that doesn't even require having Transana or in vivo. I tend to prefer to avoid software for coding that isn't really simple, because usually it doesn't store it, it stores it in proprietary formats. And I like something simple, even as simple as coding on a Word file that corresponds to the video with the numbers in it for the timestamp. Yeah, but in a nutshell, that's some ways of doing it. But yeah, it can go into it without, I think, going into full scale. I have to have research assistants who have in vivo knowledge. I find that overcomplicates it. Yeah.
Great. So we are just at 1:30. So again, I would like to thank our presenters and our audience for joining us today. We will get the recording received and published on the WHRI website next week. And if you have any questions for Andre, his email is just on this slide. If you have any questions about the sessions in general, feel free to reach out to Beth or myself. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful Thursday afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.